Okay, we are live, I hope. Welcome to the live stream of the Object-Oriented Analysis and Design course, week 40. I hope you can hear me and you can see me, and I hope that you have joined the chat. So let me know if there's any problem in the stream, please, so we can try to fix it at least. So today I think it will be a little bit of a shorter stream. You are probably busy with the peer reviews, and for the tutoring there has not been that much of new issues that have shown up really, so I don't have that much to discuss today. So let's take a look at the course overview, the plan. So we had the deadline yesterday, hand in for the peer review, and you have a few days until you should have done at least 2 peer reviews, and then a few more days until the final hand in. So there is plenty of time to improve and make a really good submission for the final hand in. For the peer review, we will take a few minutes to discuss that a little bit later, but as you can see, we have kind of like passed half the course now, and I hope you are on schedule. Online exam coming up in not next week, but next again, the first attempt for you to succeed maybe, or at least try it out, and then there are 2 more attempts scheduled for the course, and we will see if we need any more attempts after that. But usually we have 1 attempt, maybe in early December or something like that, and 1 more attempt after Christmas and stuff. So hopefully you will have plenty of opportunities to pass the test also. Right, peer review, as I said, there are some things to think about when you do the peer review. There is a high probability that you will get a very small submission maybe. Not everyone has had the time and to make the application work fully, or create this nice executable or whatnot. So please bear that in mind when you review. And if you get a really small submission, maybe you should just do your best with it and then move on to the next one instead, and maybe do 3 reviews if you think the first one was really tiny. It's always good to look at a few submissions, but at least 2 reviews, as you probably know. There's also high likelihood that you won't be able to run what you get because of different operating systems and different platforms. There's a chance that there will be some exotic programming language that you're really not used to. So I think spending about 30 minutes in trying to get things to run or compile is enough. If you haven't managed to do it like that, just focus on the code and the diagrams for the review. Don't spend days and days trying to get things to run. It can be quite hard to do that. Are we allowed to check the third submission but not review it? I would prefer if you don't do that, because if you open a submission, the system kind of like thinks that you should that you will finish it. So if there's a lot of opened but not reviewed system, there's a chance that someone will not get any reviews for their system. So it's I think you should at least have the mindset to complete the review if you do so, if you open a review. But be prepared and don't spend too much time and effort on trying to get things to run or trying to get things to compile. There's a fair amount of complexity in setting up a development environment for a language or a platform that you're not used to, and there's a chance that you will get that. So do your best with the source code and the diagrams in that case. All right, let's take a look at the final exam. So this week I prepared the final exam, and you should now be able to get your username and password. And there are the caveats there is that you need to allow scripts on the page, and that's a little bit differently handled in different versions of different web browsers, but I think you should manage. The fallback is to right click on the password area and open the iframe in a new tab if everything else fails, and that should work. Anyway, I won't show this because then you will see my password and then I have to change it, and that's messy. So you have the opportunity to take a look at the system, at least in the Sandbox, and for the Sandbox there's an exam period already open, so you can read the instructions if you want to. They are quite similar to the final instructions that you will get in the real test, but more importantly you can get a feeling for how the system works, and so that won't come as a surprise to you. So you just click to start a new test, and you can navigate the questions and you click to answer, and you save the answer, and then you move on to the next question, and so on and so forth. And if you don't want to answer, so I don't think any of these are a good description of this course, then I need to select something and deselect and then save the empty answer, so to speak. So leaving a question unanswered is not good, because then you don't have a chance to comment on it, because unanswered questions will not be corrected. There are no up-to-date questions. The example questions are I think a little bit more advanced maybe than the actual test, so if you do them you should be well prepared. So it's better to have it that way, I think. Anyway, let's just go. I will hand it in now. So when you hand it in, you can see that, I have 2 questions that I haven't answered really, but now I don't really care about that right now, so I hand in my test. unfortunately I failed. But I can at least go to the comments and add comments for the questions that I did not answer correctly. So I will see what I answered and then I can write a comment here. Very nice comment and course. And I save it, and then I can move on to the next question. When you do this for the real test, you should try to motivate why you answered the way you did and how you interpreted the question. And that can give you a bonus point. Just stating the correct answer will probably not get you a bonus point, but it can be good to do that just to verify that you have understood correctly, because I will take a look at the comments and I can write a comment on your comment and prompt you to the correct answer or how to think about the question. And when I feel done, I will hand in the comments, and then I accept that I hand in for a final grading. And my grade is not available yet because someone needs to take a look at my comments and maybe assign me a bonus point to get the final grade. All right, and when the exam period has ended, you will be able to check your answers and stuff like that. So you can find out what was wrong and stuff like this. So you can also check the real exam. The exam periods are of course not open. The first period is 14th and from 9 o'clock to 2100 hours, and the 22nd and the 13th. Alright, should probably not be open that long, a month, so I will fix that. Alright, but you have some time until the first period. And usually it's a little bit awkward to do these online tests the first time. So I think you should all take the opportunity to just try the system out at least, and not take it maybe too seriously if you fail the first attempt, because people often do a lot better the second one when they are used to the system, so to speak. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can post them in the Slack channel. If not, we will move on a little bit. So I actually had this this question in Slack about what the next crash course should be about. Maybe you haven't seen it, but I got at least one really interesting answer there. Oh, the real thing is 36 minutes. And there will be 12 questions. All right. And one interesting comment on this in this thread was that if we could take a look at the real system and do some kind of analysis or model for it, and I think that's a really interesting approach. However, it will probably take a lot of time and effort to do so, and it's hard to get commercial systems. The source code is needed more or less, so it can be a little bit tricky to do that. Of course, one could choose an open source system, but I think the complexity of a real system will be too overwhelming. And one example of that is looking at the microservices of Uber, and they look something like this. Let's see. This is an image over the microservices in Uber, and as you see, there are a lot of microservices, and they are communicating with each other in lots of different ways, and they are in some way dependent on each other. And this is of course not an easy task to do, kind of like anything anything useful with in this format at least. So This is an automatically generated graph over the Uber microservices, and well, it quickly becomes a lot, and it quickly becomes quite messy. And basically, you would have to have some goal with your modeling to make some kind of sense out of more or less raw data like this. And one could probably make a parallel to an object diagram in this case, because every dot here is probably an instance of a microservice running, and that could be considered an object that communicates with other objects. So it quickly becomes quite complicated in real systems. And this is why it's so important to try to manage your dependencies. If we can just remove a little bit of these dependencies, there is a good opportunity to make things better. I probably would not like to work in this system, because maybe I want to do something there and it can affect more or less everything. All right, another question that is a little bit maybe more related to the course is about validation. And for the workshop, there is for the passing grade, there is no real need for validation. But for the higher grades, you need some kind of validation, and validation is also an interesting task that you will probably face in real life, so to speak. And my thoughts about this is to do it in a kind of like three-step approach. So the first thing is to try to make the model valid by definition. So by this I mean try to use correct types for everything. Possibly many of you have used the boat type as a string attribute, and this means that we can more or less put anything in there. It would probably be better to have it as an enum with the different boat types that we are allowed, and this means that the boat type is valid by definition. So if it's in the model, it must be of the correct type. And that is always something to strive for. So try to make the model valid by definition. So you cannot put things that are not correct into the model. Another example would be the boat length. Maybe it's not an integer or a string even. It's maybe this special length type that has a minimum length and a maximum length of 50, or what kind of length we now want to support in the system. So you cannot simply create a length that is invalid, so to speak, and this means that the both length and type are always valid if we can create those types. Same thing, maybe member name is not a string, but it's a name type. So try to make the model valid by definition. That's the first step. Then we can think about, okay, having this is nice, because then we know kind of like the model is safe, more or less. But we probably need validation, because the user can input something and just getting some strange error message is not very nice. And depending on the type of view, it could be more or less cumbersome to do this validation. You probably have the most cumbersome user interfaces, because you input text freely in the console, and the user can input anything, and that needs to be handled in some way. So for example, if we use the text input for both length, we need a lot of validation. Is this even a number that the user has entered? That's kind of like maybe the first step of the validation. And this is probably things that are specific for a text input in the view. For example, if we have a user interface, a graphical user interface, maybe we have a slider or something for the length, and we can initialize this widget to not allow for lengths that are not valid. And this means that we don't need to have a lot of validation in the view, because the number that we get should be valid by definition. because we have put those limits in the widget already. So that is also something you can think about. How much of this validation I do now is done just because I have this type of user interface. And there is a tendency to push kind of like these services into the model. So instead of making the model valid by definition, you can send strings into the model, and you need to have a lot of validation in the model. And this is probably a consequence because you have this text input in the view. And the third step then is probably to have validation in the model finally. And there are cases where a simple type is not enough. We can, for example, imagine the little student registration system that I'm working on. We need to make sure that we don't add a student with the same email. And this is, well, you can of course have validation on an email type, but adding a student, you can of course create emails that are duplicates, but when you want to add a student, that's when the validation needs to take place. And then there is the chance to throw exceptions if the data is invalid in some way, violates some business rule. And often you need to add some kind of services to get good usability. So in the example of adding a student with a duplicate email address, I would probably add some kind of query functionality to the model. Is email taken or something like that checks this requirement, and a user interface can use that to get a nicer user friendliness in their user interface. Another example could be that if you have kind of like this password part that's validated with some funky regex stuff for length and special characters or something like that, maybe the user interface can also get access to this regex and use that to just quickly try what the user is inputting, so that you don't need to fill in the big form and click submit or what you have. So that is probably my my take on validation. So try to make the model valid by definition. Nothing illegal should be able to enter the model by using programming constructs. You often need to think about validation that is specific for certain types of views or certain types of inputs. And of course it's nicer to have an input that cannot be wrong, also by definition, more or less, because you use some kind of a widget or some type of selection to make it easier for the user to input the correct data. And finally, you need probably to have some type of model validation. So you throw exceptions, and you can write your own exception classes, of course, to make it easy for the handlers of these exceptions to know what has actually gone wrong. And you probably need to add some type of services for increased usability, so that views and controllers can query for specific business rules that they may want to do. For example, get the minimum and maximum allowed lengths from this length type, so that I can initialize my slider widget to the correct values, something like that. Could even be interesting maybe to set it to the default to a default length that is the mean length of all of the boats in the system or something like that. So the most common length, maybe we should initialize the user interface to that value. All right. Finally, I've actually worked a little bit more on the student system that I talked quite a lot about last time, and I actually did implement WebSockets. And well, first of all, the code is now published, so you can get it in the course GitHub repository. and download it and get it up and running and stuff like that. And as usual, it's the view that's most interesting, and there is this WebSocket view, and the client is probably the most interesting part to look at, because here you have kind of like the communication protocol, and it's quite a simple protocol. The server sends text strings to through the WebSocket, and that's about it. And it then tells the client what it should do. And I even implemented a a small user interface using JavaScript and Bootstrap. Not really my cup of tea, but it seems to be working at least. It's a little bit interesting. You have the code for that also in the GitHub repo, but this type of way of writing web applications is quite different, because you have state now that's running in this server. So for every client you have a living state, so to speak, and this means that we can do some interesting stuff. For example, if one client decides to list all of the students and add a new student, it can immediately show up in the list of the other user. So I now know that someone has added this new student immediately. And interesting also is if someone is changing the same student, what should happen then? So I immediately can now change the same form on the other user. So this is a little bit of interesting things that can be done using an approach to web applications using this type of model view controller with a passive view and an supervising controller that decides what it is that should happen all the time. So it's a little bit interesting. I don't think it will be a very great way of doing web applications, but it can at least be done. And it shows that you can reuse the controller in a number of different scenarios, a number of different views, working quite differently. And as you saw last time, maybe we could have the same user interface, the same system using several different user interfaces on the same machine. And we have now moved to a distributed system, and this puts different types of requirements, of course, on the system itself. What should happen if someone deletes the student someone else is working on, for example? What should happen if someone adds a student? And we can probably have race conditions with the email addresses and stuff like that. So there are some interesting new things to think about in these cases. But anyway, you can study the code if you want to, and if someone else has better experience than me in writing JavaScript clients, could be an interesting thing to try to make a nice user interface for this. Running the server is quite easy, because you just run the main program in a Java console, and you just use connect it to localhost. All right, but you can do some interesting things, like getting data to be updated in several user interfaces more or less concurrently. And I could of course also run the usual Swing UI and the console UI, as well as having all of these web browser interfaces connected to the same system. So the next step, I think, in this is probably to add a little bit more of a validation and see what happens also. For example, it should not be allowed to add the same email address, and maybe the email address should not be a string but the real email address. So maybe I should add that, and then you will see an example of this validation thing for real, so to speak. All right. I think that was more or less it for this week's live stream. Yeah, I'm at the end of my slides. So if there are no more questions, there was a question actually in Slack. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. So I did talk about data validation, how to compile source code into a runnable jar file. Not really my area of expertise. I think you could probably find some good tutorials on that online. Yeah, it's easy to miss things on in live streams. Best practices about implementing the search in workshop 2. Thinking about using the strategy pattern for creating member matchers and a factor for instantiating these matches. Yes, I think you are onto something there, especially the strategy pattern for creating some kind of a member matching algorithm or something like that. Would be interesting to know a little bit more about your thoughts, so please book a tutoring session and we can take a look at it, and I can probably give you some pointers. But it is the correct way to think about the simple search, that okay, we have small algorithms that can select a member or not select a member. That's a good starting point. I don't think you need the factory pattern for instantiating the matchers. For the higher grade, it's enough if you hard code some examples of search expressions or something like that, search objects or something like that. So you don't need to parse a string or something like this from the user interface, because that's a lot of quite boring coding. There is no coding in the exam, but you could get a question with some kind of a pseudocode in it, but you won't write code yourself. The pseudocode is quite Java or C# like, and it's nothing really advanced. All right, and here we also had this data validation question. I discussed that quite a lot today. So, any more questions? All right, as I said, a little bit shorter today. There will be new opportunities for tutoring next week. We will probably have a little bit less of tutoring that week and ramp it up maybe towards the end, or at least towards the deadline for the final hand-in. But there will be some sessions available soon, I hope. And also we are working hard at the Workshop 1 examination, and I hope this will be finished by early next week, and it should be, if all goes according to plan. All right, that's it for now. Have a great weekend and take care. Bye bye.